Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Gulsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science. All right, Will, we're back again, and we got some good stuff today.
We do.
Yeah. First of all, I've been noticing here lately that we're having a bunch of turkey stories.
Mm-hmm.
And so far, all of those have been about somebody getting a turkey with me. And I've just, had a question for you. Do you have any stories about people getting turkeys with you?
Yeah, I do. As it turns out.
Yeah. Well, I know our audience. I've actually gotten... Well, I haven't gotten any messages about it. I'm not going to tell you I did, but I thought it would be funny if I had gotten a bunch of messages asking me that question. Does Will have any turkey stories? Because they're all Lashley.
Well, it's just because, you cherry pick to have all these guests on that are your hunting buddies.
Oh, yeah. Well.
But I don't have any friends, so.
Oh, is that it?
So I just hunt with my wife.
You don't have any hunting buddies?
I just hunt with my wife, and she's about hunting some turkeys, but she's not about turkey science. She just lets me take care of that part. She's like,
yeah. Well, do we need to invite your wife on the show?
I feel like that side. She says, I feel like that side of the equation is in good hands with you, so I'm just going to go out here and shoot him in the face.
Yeah, I can respect that, But I'm not above asking her to come on the show either. So I thought that would be fun for us to get a little story time with Dr. Gulsby about this recent trip you had. I think folks would like to hear that.
Yeah, so it was actually her second turkey that she's ever killed.
Oh wow.
So she's gone with me a few times. In Georgia and Alabama, maybe she's gone in South Carolina with me before, but since we've been here in Alabama, I mostly have been hunting my lease, which is about an hour and 15 minutes south of our house. So that makes for some pretty early morning wake-up calls.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is I try to spend a lot of time with the family on the weekends, so I try to sneak in mornings before work to go down there. And so, she doesn't have that flexibility that I do in her job. So she doesn't make it out with me very often. So anyways, about a little over a year ago, I got connected with Chuck Ward, who, is a Turkeys for Tomorrow member. And, he was kind of there with the organization at the beginning, and he's got a day job, but then he also kind of guides, it's like a semi-guided hunt operation in South Texas. And he, kind of said, well, come on down and, hunt with us sometime. And he was already booked up. This was prior to the 2022 season, and he was already booked up for that year. And so I went ahead and put down a deposit, and I was like, we're coming, 2023. And, I've never hunted Rios before. And my wife was really interested in going along, with me as well. So we booked it, and, we were down there last week. We got in on Friday, hunted Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And it was a pretty cool trip because, like I said, it's semi-guided. So the way that they run their hunts is that they have permission across all these ranches in the area. Because believe it or not, like most people in South Texas don't care about hunting turkeys.
What is wrong with those people?
I can't understand it, but I'm also glad that they don't, because they're willing to give, folks like Chuck and his outfit permission to come hunt these ranches.
Yeah. That's cool.
And we got to take advantage of that. So anyway, they got this new piece last year that they had hunted adjacent to before and heard a lot of birds on. So they had interest in securing access there, and we were the first people to hunt it. And, the good thing about it was, that it was undisturbed. The bad thing about it was we didn't have a lot of intel on it, so it really ended up being like kind of a new permission piece that you get anywhere that you have to kind of learn the birds on. So we did that over the course of Friday and Saturday, and kind of had those birds patterned and knew where they were roosting, knew where they were moving to each morning, and we got on them Sunday morning. Um, and I won't go into all the details. I've probably already provided too much of that, but we ended up having three strutters out in front of us at about 40, 45 yards. And we were watching those, and we were waiting for those to come into Neva's shot window for her to line up on it. And I'm just huddled down behind her. And next thing you know, I hear drumming off to my left, and we've got another three strutters that came in at like 35 yards. And the hardest thing about it for me was that, I'm sitting there with a gun in my hand with strutters at 35 yards, but I can't shoot them, or otherwise she's not going to get a bird. So I have to wait on the
Oh
birds out in
man.
front of her to come out. So those birds ended up coming out, and she was successful. And by the time she shot, the three that came in to my left had already kind of moved off.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the end of it. But we had a really good time.
But you ended up getting one though, right?
No, I didn't. She shot all. We killed 3 birds on that hunt, and
Oh.
yeah, and she got all 3 of them. And so the way that it works
Oh.
is, yeah. So I still haven't killed a Rio.
Oh man.
But the way that it works is the hunt that we bought. Each hunter gets 2 Rios. We had 4 tags.
Mm-hmm.
So that was well within the bag limits. But I ended up, because she was in good position to shoot on that hunt, and so I just let her take one of my birds, and I didn't get the 4th. We had to fly
Wow.
out. I'm pretty sure we could have got back on that group of 3 that came in to my left, but we just didn't have the time to get back on them and work them before we had to fly out.
Wow. I'm not sure if you set yourself up for failure at home or earn some real browning points here.
I earned some real brownie points, and I appreciate the Chuck and Joe is one of the other guys that helps out there, making it very clear to her how much her husband loves her to allow her that opportunity.
Yeah.
And he was, I think it was Joe that I said it to him, and he agreed with me. I was like, I told her, I said, Neva, there's probably a lot of guys that would have gotten divorced over the way things played out this weekend.
Well, I don't know what her demeanor is at home, but I can see how this might go at my house. And, there would be some flaunting going on.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. This Rio fan was in the way. I can't see what you're talking about because I can't see over these Rio fans. Like that's the kind of stuff that my spouse would be doing. She would be rubbing it in for sure.
Yeah. Well, she's not that type of person, luckily.
Yeah. Well, good for you.
And it was one of those things. Do I want to go back and kill another one? Yes. I have an excuse to do it as well now. And at that point, when you get to that point in the hunt, I feel like I'd put all the pieces in place for us to be successful. She's just the one that pulled the trigger.
Yeah. Well, and I see what you're doing here. See, if you had killed one, then there was no reason to go back. So you basically let her feel the excitement and all that.
Mm-hmm.
And then you didn't get one. So now you have to go back, and she's going to be down with that because
that's right.
She was all in the middle of it. And
that's right. But one of the things that I asked her, she was on cloud 9 the whole way home, even though our flight, oh my gosh, we had that bad band of weather come through, and we ended up getting our flight delayed. Then we were in a holding pattern over the airport. Then we sat on the tarmac for another hour. 1 out of 10 travel experience. Do not recommend. But she was on cloud 9 in spite of it the whole time. And finally, I looked over at her and I was like, "You get it now, don't you?" And she was like, "Yeah." I get it. And I said, it's better than deer hunting, isn't it? She's not ready to give that up yet. She's not
Oh
ready to
my.
concede that, but
Yeah. Well, y'all have to go back then.
I think she's getting closer. But if you've never had a chance to hunt Rios, I highly recommend it. It's down there where we were. It's a high density population. Those birds are very aggressive. They call, they gobble throughout the day. It's so fun.
Yeah, I'm definitely one of those people that I want to get that opportunity and have not taken it yet. So
the thing that I've struggled with the most is that it's so flat down there, and then all the cover is either almost too dense to walk through, or it's just wide open. So figuring out how to move on birds is very challenging.
Yeah.
And if you're not, especially if they're out in the open, unless you fan them or something like that, it's hard to get close to them. And I didn't want to do, like, personally, that's just, I chose not to do that. And so, that can make it challenging as well.
Yeah. Well, that's good. I'm glad we got to share one of your stories. And yeah, a three bird hunt. That's pretty good.
Yeah, it is. Absolutely.
So are y'all going to do anything with it, with the, like, mount one, or?
No, we didn't decide to do that, but I got the fans and everything.
Yeah, that's cool.
I got those drying out in the garage.
Yeah. I see. So when you get one, you'll full body mount that one and put it on the kitchen table or something.
Absolutely. I told her it wasn't in the budget this year.
Yeah. It will be next year. Yeah. That's funny. Well, let's go on and transition here into some more business-like discussion, we'll say.
Well, I mean, that's why we want to talk about this stuff, right? Because we want to make sure we get to keep having those experiences.
Exactly. And sharing those experiences with our loved ones and friends and family. I mean, that's all what it's all about. So I'm glad you were able to share that. But, that's why we're here too. We're trying to make sure that that we spread knowledge on how to make more turkeys and more opportunity. Yeah. So, we've gotten plenty of feedback now. I think that people like us to go into a little story time here and there. So I'm glad we finally got you a story in there.
I probably should have shared a little bit more detail here and there, but I've told the story so many times over the past couple of days that I'm getting, how you start to get kind of burnt out on it?
Yeah.
I mean, not that it diminishes the experience at all. It's just going into all the details, but
yeah. Well, I'm glad you didn't feel it necessary to go into the details on there.
Yeah. The best part of it was, though, and I don't know if I mentioned, maybe I did mention this, but I was so laser focused on the birds that were coming out in front of her. But the way that I first discovered that the birds had come in from our left was sitting here looking over her shoulder, and then I just hear, yeah. And that was the first time she'd ever heard drumming.
I was just about to ask if she heard drumming before, and did she hear it then?
And she was like, I felt it in my soul. And I said, I know.
It is. It's that I don't even understand it. When you hear it, it's like, what? I don't understand.
Yeah.
Yeah. Really cool. Well, we've been getting peppered with questions about and comments related to some things that we wanted to talk about today. We really wanted to focus on, what has changed on the landscape. And we keep getting questions and comments, and several folks have said, my place has been the same for the last 25 years. I don't understand why you're saying things have changed, and I don't see any of that change where I'm at, and my turkeys are still gone.
Yeah, and a lot of people even apply that to the entire region of the country that they live in too. I had a conversation with a hunter in camp while we were down there last week, where when he said, I hunt, I won't even name it, but I hunt in this other state, and he was like, nothing's changed there. Yeah, I can agree that things have changed in the South, but then this other state outside the Southeast, nothing's changed.
Yeah. Well, I know we've both done some homework on this topic in preparation, and it's interesting. We kind of went a different way with it. So we were trying not to communicate what we were doing with each other, so that it would be, we usually do that. We go about digging up information differently and think about things differently, and there's some value in that, but also, uh, we're getting more candid responses to each other when we get on the
Yeah.
air, and so all that's good. But when we debrief, right, or briefed, I guess, right before the episode started, we realized that we probably have gone about this enough differently that we might even ought to split it up
Yeah.
into 2 episodes. So I just wanted to start by kind of pitching the ball to you, because I think you went more the route of what has changed across the landscape just in the
Hmm.
past few decades. What kinds of things, or where do you want to start with that topic? What has changed just in general across the landscape?
Yeah. Yeah. And to your point, Marcus, one of the things that I think we've made the mistake of doing in the past is we both of us are so passionate about this that we get excited when we dig up some little tidbit of information that I immediately want to shoot you a text or get or call
Yeah,
you and say, "Can you believe this statistic
yeah,
that I just dug up?" And that's good, I guess, but also it takes away some of that genuine reaction that we could potentially have if we share it on the air. And
yeah.
we don't want to replow that ground again like we did. But
Yeah. Well, I think we've
yeah,
realized, and the audience probably appreciates the value in that when like the genosequencing human scat
yeah,
thing. That obviously was the first time we had discussed that, and it was
right,
on the air, and we've gotten so much feedback about how much people
yeah,
appreciated that we did that. So, yeah.
yeah.
So lay
So
it on
so
me. What'd you
so I
find?
Yeah, so the focus of a lot of the background digging that I did was on land use slash land cover changes at
Hmm.
broad scales, like what has happened. Um, and I've got some information, a little bit here and there from the Midwest and some from the Great Plains states. But honestly, and you know, guys that are out there listening, I mean, sometimes we get feedback saying we focus too intensively on the Southeast. Unfortunately, our major reason for that is not just that we work here and we're most familiar with the literature from here, but if you do a lot of literature searches on these topics, there's a whole lot. It seems like oftentimes there's a lot more research from this region than there are others. So we've got data, more data, and on a greater variety of topics,
Hmm.
oftentimes from here. Um, so anyway, one of the first things as I started down this path that stood out to me, there was this paper by Martin Uzzi. I guess I'm saying that right. It's Martin and then Uzzi, and they published this paper in 2015. It was a modeling exercise that was predicting habitat change across the southeastern U.S. Um, and one of the comments that they made that stunned me. Um, it's not that surprising in and of itself, but it's just how strongly it backs a lot of what we've already been talking about, especially with the limitations of brooding and nesting cover. My bad. And that's that in general, this is across, a wide variety of wildlife species, not just wild turkeys, but those species with the highest rates of habitat loss all shared the trait of being associated with grasslands, pastures, prairies, and open woodlands.
Checks out.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
So,
that's something that's been striking to me, and I say it relatively often, but a lot of our species of conservation concern are, at least at one part of their life cycle, obligated or assisted by one of those vegetation types.
hmm exactly. And so they went on to look at rates of land cover change within a wildlife habitat lens. And they modeled that out, predicted it out into the future based on those rates of change that they were able to document over recent years. And they predicted that by 2050, which is where they modeled out to, that 10 to 20% of grasslands and forests are expected to be replaced by either agriculture or urban development. So that conversion and that loss of those cover types that are so important, especially to turkeys, is predicted to continue for quite a bit. Another thing that they pointed out is that from 2006 2011, And those of you in the Midwest will appreciate this because it's relevant to you. That the Western Corn Belt has lost 1.3 million acres of grass-dominated land cover. 1.3 million acres of grass-dominated land cover has been lost to agriculture, row crop agriculture, in that Western Corn Belt region.
And how long?
From 2006 to 2011, a 5-year period.
That seems like a really rapid change.
It is. That struck me too.
Wow. How many acres are there still? Does it say anything about that?
No, I didn't see
or
that
like
statistic.
A proportion or man. Okay.
So this kind of brings me to another point that I wanted to get into, because a lot of the other literature that I dug up outside that paper was related to the Conservation Reserve Program, because obviously that Conservation Reserve Program concerns itself with converting certain land uses to others that are more conservation friendly, or that's the intent. And so a lot of the research involving land use change involves some component of the Conservation Reserve Program. And there was a paper by, Carmichael Jr. that I dug up. It's from 1997, so it's a little dated, but a lot of the information was still relevant. And they were specifically looking at CRP, Conservation Reserve Program, and its influences on wildlife habitat. And one of the things that they noted, and for that exact reason that I just mentioned from that other paper, is that CRP has really benefited Midwestern and Great Plains states the most, because of the fact that they're implementing these field border practices and allowing the edges of these agricultural fields to revegetate herbaceous plants, grasses, native warm season grasses, and forbs. And so in that regard, the Conservation Reserve Program has been particularly helpful throughout that ag belt and kind of the heartland of the United States.
Yeah. So basically, we converted a bunch of the grassland. It sounds like it's still happening a lot. To agriculture from ditch to ditch, so to speak, and then CRP comes in at what time frame?
The original wasn't the original Farm Bill in 1985.
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's when we started converting. We probably had widespread adoption over the next couple decades.
Yep.
And then how long I'm wondering about the contract length now.
I think they're up to 10 years.
Okay. So we potentially have a situation. Do you think that could explain how we have a whole bunch of grassland now that's getting converted back? Is it that we've run out on contracts?
It may be. One of the things that was a recurring theme that I came across throughout the literature on this topic was that commodity prices tend to drive habitat.
Yeah.
And particularly, if you're talking about row crop prices, when those go up, you're going to get more land converted to agriculture. When timber prices go up, you're going to get more land converted to industrial pine forest,
Right.
which is just intuitive. One of the biggest concerns, and I didn't think we would get into this for a little while, but it just kind of fits in so naturally here that I figure we might as well go ahead and talk about it. But the problem with that I see, and I actually think I had a bullet point on this, but I won't bore you guys by digging for it. But is that when that land is converted, oftentimes it's never recovered, or it's never recovered back to the state that it was in prior to that conversion. And that's especially true if the conversion either directly involves or incidentally involves the establishment of like exotic pasture grasses or something along those lines. And so if you think about it, let's say that cattle prices go up, and that encourages a lot more farmers to, clear areas or to take fallow fields back into pasture. And, they introduce exotic pasture grasses. for that reason. Well, eventually maybe that landowner ages out of the business, or those prices go back down, and they take that area out of livestock production, but the legacy of that exotic pasture grass establishment is going to remain.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Yeah,
just
that's a
because
good
they
point.
cease production there doesn't mean that habitat immediately returns to the quality for turkeys that it was previously in.
Yeah. Well, and I hear the word, or the acronym, I guess, CRP thrown around all the time, like it means something specific.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality, I don't know how many conservation practices fall under CRP, but it's a
There's a
whole
bunch
bunch
of
of them.
them. Yeah. But the two that I'm most familiar with, and I guess we should have established this up front, are the field borders that we've already talked
Mm-hmm.
about. So just, this is where NRCS administers the Farm Bill and the CRP program. And what happens is they essentially, correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, Marcus, you may be more familiar with it than I am, but they pay a rental fee for
Mm-hmm.
those farmers to set aside a certain acreage around the periphery of their fields and allow that to revegetate into grassland to provide wildlife habitat. And then it also has soil health, water quality, um,
Mm-hmm.
improvement objectives as well.
Yeah.
And so that one tends to be predominantly implemented in heavy agricultural regions.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other practice that I'm most familiar with is reclaiming agricultural lands by planting pines in the southeast. That's a
Mm-hmm.
big one too.
Yeah. And I am very familiar with a couple of other ones, particularly CP42, which is pollinator practice.
Hmm.
And that offsets the costs of establishing uh, foreblend, flowers for pollinators, but
Hmm.
poult rearing cover is what I think about when I think about the
Yeah.
pollinator practice. So, some of these things I think we should point out also. If you have a property where it's been in agriculture of some type, even if it was cattle, you may qualify for some of these, and you have a
Hmm.
local NRCS office wherever you're at, and I'd encourage you to look into them. But the point that I was trying to make is there's a whole bunch of different kinds of practices, and some of them might be beneficial,
Hmm.
at least for some part of the contract for turkeys, and some of them might not be.
Right. And we'll talk about that in just a second.
Yeah.
But
So,
I think another point to make too is that even even if because we're probably about to get into this in a little bit, but if we generally talk about a CRP practice having negative effects on wildlife, it's not necessarily that that specific practice always has to have a negative effect. It's just the way that that practice is commonly implemented or
or maintained.
maintained
Yeah.
over time on the landscape.
Mm-hmm.
And that brings me into another point of something that I wanted to cover, because you just brought up the origin of the conservation reserve program a little bit earlier, and I had a listener, Todd Henry was his name. He reached out to me and sent me a private message, and he noted that he's from Missouri, or at least he hunts in Missouri. We get a lot of passionate Missouri turkey hunters
Isn't
that
that
reach out to
something?
us. By the way, yeah.
That's got to be the state that's most active in our
Yeah, I
our
really
comments.
appreciate their passion for turkey hunting and that turkey hunting culture in the state.
Yeah.
But he noted that in Missouri, the turkey population, or at least the part of the state that he's in, exploded in the late '80s, and he said quail exploded concurrent with that. And he thought, he noted the correlation. It's not necessarily causation, but there is a correlation
Mm.
in the time frame of those populations increasing with implementation of CRP. And he went on to say that most farms that they hunted that had population increases were enrolled in that program. And he watched these areas that were reclaimed kind of develop. And over those first few years, he noted that these field borders had that weedy condition that you would expect. That's ideal for broods. It's ideal for quail. But then, as time went on, what he noticed is they slowly were encroached on by tall fescue,
Hmm.
and they eventually, over time, turned into these thick rank stands of grass that are of limited utility to quail and to turkey broods.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's really interesting and matches the timing well.
It does. Yeah.
Yeah. And I know we don't want to get too much into it just yet because we got a lot to cover just in the landscape change, but there's other things associated with this that are more localized that have changed in practices around this that matter a lot, or they could.
And that's more of what you looked into versus the broad scale changes that I looked at.
Yeah.
So let's jump into some of those real quick if you're ready.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. So already covered loss of grasslands and forest being replaced by ag and urban. Population increases. Saw, lots of data on human population increases over time and the development that goes along with that. So here in the Southeast, the Piedmont, and this was a paper by Knapton and others, 2009. They were looking at land changes and driving forces in the southeastern United States. They kind of broke this down by ecoregion, and they found that the Piedmont was one of the areas where forested area was declining, mostly because those areas were primarily targeted for development. In the southeastern plains, so further down in the lower coastal plain, there was a lot of agriculture conversion over to forest, and that's probably somewhat associated with the CRP. Forest in the mid-Atlantic coastal plain declined, and development increased there as well. And they overall, before I go on, in the Blue Ridge, so southern Appalachia, the human population increased about 63% from the 70s to 2000. In the Piedmont ecoregion, the human population grew 82%
over that same time
period.
So what was the time frame again?
1970s to 2000.
All right.
And so
80 plus percent.
Yeah. Yeah, and so all the land clearing and development that goes along with that. Another point that they made out, we've already been talking about Farm Bill a lot. That was implemented in 1985. I had the date right there. I don't know why I missed it earlier. And by
good thing we recollected correctly.
Right. And by 1992, 7 years later, the Conservation Reserve Program was responsible for the conversion of, drumroll please, 2.5 million acres of cropland to forest.
That's a lot.
And you know what type of forest most of that probably was.
Pine.
Yeah. Particularly loblolly pine.
Yes, loblolly pine.
Which,
okay,
not to give loblolly pine a bad name, but...
Well, wait, I think when was that?
By 1992.
92.
Yeah, this is an important point I think you're about to make.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about the progression of pine stand.
Yeah, let's do it.
You want to do it now?
Why not?
Okay, so we have a ton, especially through the Pine Belt, right?
Mm-hmm.
A ton of land that all went into pine all at the same time.
That's right.
I forget, a couple million acres, you said.
Yeah,
and that exact number.
So that was how much 2.5 million acres were converted between 1985 and 1992.
Yeah.
But I'll throw out some broader scale statistics relative to this conversation as well. We've gotten to the point now where, this paper was published in 2018. This was Fagan et al. Across the Southeast, pine plantations represent nearly 20% of the landscape.
That's just like of the land area.
Of all land area, they're 20%.
So some of that is human development, some of it's water, some of it's agriculture, some of it's forest. And it's a fifth of the landscape is pine plantation.
It's a fifth of the landscape, and it's a third of forested cover in the Southeast. Yeah. So 30% of forested cover in the Southeast is planted pine.
And that is including public land, including
Yes.
anywhere that's woods.
Including suburban areas and the forest in those areas. Yeah.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
now let's talk about the progression of those relevant to that timeline and turkeys.
Yeah. Well, if you think about the typical loblolly pine rotation, and we're planting a bunch of trees per acre, really high density of trees that can vary somewhat. I don't know what it was under those contracts necessarily, but there's also that was kind of the pine boom from the way I view it. A lot of other acres went into pine plantation at that same time that weren't necessarily under contract.
Mm-hmm.
So, which is I think represented by what you just said with those stats. A lot of our forests are pine plantations.
And it's been intensified to
Yeah.
your point. And I've got a stat on that too. This is from Fox and others, 2007, development of pine plantation silviculture in the Southeast. Plantations in the 50s and 60s produced approximately on average 90 cubic feet per acre per year of wood, compared to plantations established in the 2000s that are producing about 400 cubic feet per acre per year. So
Do what? Wait, we went from 90?
We went from 90 to 400 cubic
Wow.
feet per acre per year.
More
And
than
so,
fourfold?
yeah.
That's impressive.
So we're stacking a lot more trees, growing them
Faster, more
faster
intensively.
on more on smaller acreages.
Yeah, and I want to talk about some of the practices. I think they're probably not directly pertinent in this part of the conversation, but we'll get to it. But we've also been managing those pine plantations very differently.
Yeah.
In a couple of key ways that might matter a lot for turkeys. But so let's just talk about that timeline. We plant a whole bunch of trees in the mid 90s.
Let's just say 1990 for easy math.
Yeah. And then a decade or so later, we're in the early 2000s now, and we have a whole bunch of mid-rotation, closed canopy pine that is blocking all the sunlight out and it's basically not usable for a turkey.
Yeah.
So we're talking about a time within, let's say, 4 or 5 years on average, are probably getting some use at establishment.
Mm-hmm.
They might be using it for poult rearing really early and then nesting.
Yeah, that's
for a
what I would
couple of
think
years.
is like years 1 and 2 would be poult rearing, and then you start to get to like 2, 3, 4. They're going to be nesting.
Yeah.
5 and 6, they still may be nesting around the edges.
Yeah, a little bit.
7, 8, pretty much. You've just got a short forest, this closed canopy that they might fly into to get away from a coyote or something.
Right, and they're not using it much, and we have data on that. I don't have it in front of me. There was some data from Mississippi, I think, that was talking about the turkey use. We need to dig that up. I'll go through it when I have the data. I don't want to misspeak on it, but and then we get to that. We basically have about a decade there where we're in that condition before you get to your mid-rotation thin.
Mm-hmm.
And then we would return it back to an open canopy. We'll get some desirable structure in that forest.
Yeah, so you thin it at 15 years.
Yeah. I was thinking about 18, but somewhere in that area. And then you'll get several years probably out of that. Same kind of thing, 3 to 5 years maybe, where you're getting some use by turkeys. And then it's in a condition again where the use is relatively low of it. Right. And then you're at clear cut.
Yeah.
Which happens to coincide really well with when a lot of decline started showing up.
Yeah. And talking to John Grucci, who's a biologist in Mississippi, and we hope to have him on as part of this series that we're starting now, which is going to be focused on, today, like we're talking about these large-scale habitat changes across the landscape. And then I hope through this series, as we line up these speakers, what we're able to do is to break that out into the different segments, so we can talk with people from timber industry, for example, and so on, and we can get in a little bit more granular there.
Well,
but talking to him,
we're definitely getting peppered a ton with habitat stuff. People want to
Yeah.
know what has changed and what can they do. And
Right.
and we've got a kind of a mega series we're beginning here
Yeah.
where we're gonna pepper you back with it. We're gonna give
Yeah.
you all you can eat.
So talking to John, he noted to me that at least what he's seen in Mississippi is that, a lot of that CRP pine never got thinned. So we didn't even have that,
Mm-hmm.
3-year, 5-year flush and increase by increase in turkey use.
Yeah.
And even probably even more likely is that none of it's getting clear cut either.
Mm-hmm.
And so if it's never been thinned and it's never been clear cut, I mean, that's essentially all those acres that were converted into planted pine are being locked up
Yeah.
and receiving essentially very little turkey use. And there's a variety of factors that are potentially driving that. Some of this land is changing hands and it's going into ownership of younger generations that may not be as familiar with, typical
Mm-hmm.
silvicultural practices and how to manage those areas. And then I think a lot of it too is being driven by, timber markets and,
Mm-hmm.
whether or not there's even availability or interest of loggers in an area to try to, thin or clear cut the stand to
Mm-hmm.
try to start it over and recover some of that turkey habitat.
Yeah, no, the market has also changed
Right.
substantially in ways that people may not even realize. Just to give you one tidbit that kind of made me take a step back and really think that I was talking to someone who had worked in a paper mill for a long time, and
Mm-hmm.
he said that the formula for making paper for that particular mill, in terms of the proportion that's pine versus hardwood, had completely reversed. So the way that they were making the paper out of the two components had changed substantially to make the pine basically less valuable in
Mm.
that scenario. Which I thought I didn't even think about that.
Yeah.
Obviously, the markets are changing. We've also got a situation where we have a ton of timber all at the same stage coming into the market at the same time, and then
Yeah.
potentially even things within the products that are changing.
Yeah.
We
And then
so
there's been lots of mill closures,
yeah.
so, if you're in a particular part of a state that typically has a really great pulpwood market and then that pulp mill closes down, and so it presents a situation where a logger would have to transmit or transport pulp logs, 80 miles to be
Hmm.
processed at a mill, it no longer becomes, a desirable operation for them,
Hmm.
just because they're going to lose so much money on transporting such a great distance.
Yeah. So we probably have, and I'm sure we're going to get plenty of feedback from the audience if you're in this situation. A lot of our listeners, I know that at least some of the people I've worked with in the past, they can't get the timber moved on their property. They won't pay
Yeah.
its way off, or
Yep.
they don't have a market for it, or something.
Hmm.
And okay. Well, another thing, I actually dug up a paper, and it has some relevant information of this, and I was going to talk about it more broadly. But another thing that is very clear is that those forests aren't being burned either.
That's right.
So even through that whole process, like the mid rotation thinning, you could extend the value of that substantially by having fire. You also could at stand establishment. Obviously, a lot of people are planting loblolly, aren't burning it early in that rotation because they're not trying to kill all the seedlings they planted. But that's not everybody. I know a few that are doing that. They're not worried about the timber value. Uh, so that practice could substantially alter that timeline. If you have enough sunlight penetrating, you could get a lot out of that fire, and the fire would extend those windows
Right.
and the quality of the window. So that's something to keep in mind. But this paper that I looked at is actually focused on a a uh, a paradigm. We'll say it's called mesification,
Hmm.
and that's a real fancy word for uh, forest transitioning to a water loving state.
Hmm.
So that may not be necessarily that intuitive to people, but I'm trying to make it more so. So you
Please
think
explain.
about, yeah. So we historically had all these forests that were dominated, especially in the southeast, but just in the eastern United States in general, they were dominated by species that were pyrophytic. In other words, they love fire and they have characteristics that promote fire. Most people, when I say that, think about pine trees. Those are some that love that love fire. Pines have needles that promotes the spread of fire. They're really flammable. They have thick bark on them that protects them from being top killed by fire. All kinds of adaptations that are obviously for fire. We have a bunch of hardwoods like that, particularly upland oaks, that also fit that bill. They have things, characteristics about their leaves, for instance, like the lobing, the way that they curl when they dry. It makes the leaf litter really fluffy. And all of those things promote fire. Some of our white oak species in particular also have corky bark that protects them from top kill. They're also vigorously resprouting when they get top killed by fire. And
their acorns germinate under the surface of the soil.
Yeah, they're and a lot of acorns actually don't get killed by fire when it passes over them. There's some cool work from Kate Greenberg on that. But this paper, the first paper that kind of presented this paradigm, was from Nowak and Abrams in 2008. And we'll share all these in the show notes. I know we're throwing a bunch of them out there at you
We're
guys.
racking them up today.
Yeah, just rolling them out. This will be the only one during this episode that I throw out, I think.
Okay.
Maybe one or two more. I mean, just for good measure. So, but, well, I'll throw out one other one. I have done a follow-up with a bunch of colleagues that we published in 2020, I think. And we'll add that one as well. And that was actually one of your colleagues, was the lead author, Heather Alexander, who's a forest ecologist there at Auburn now. At the time, her and I worked closely at Mississippi State when we were putting that paper together.
Right.
But there was a follow-up to this Nowak and Abrams. But essentially, what happens in these plant communities, and people have probably seen it once I say it, they probably start realizing that they're seeing that happen. You have all these pyrophytic species, and even go several decades further back, we had open forest conditions that were promoted by frequent fire. And what frequent is changes a little bit depending on where you're at, but fire reoccurring, you end up in over time with a bunch of tree species in the canopy that are pyrophytic. In other words, they promote fire and they have a lot of adaptations to withstand fire. And that includes a lot of our upland oaks, like white oak, very pyrophytic species. We had all those dominating these broken canopy open forest types with frequent fire. And as soon as you remove fire out of that system, which started really aggressively happening in like the 1920s or so, you start this transition where all those mesophytic species like red maple and sweet gum and
that are
a couple
not
of
fire
hickories,
adapted.
yeah, that would be the other side of that gradient. We'd call them mesophytic. So that's kind of the opposing to pyrophytic. So they actually start to get established. They don't have very good strategies to deal with being killed by fire, but they do have a really interesting thing where they actually make the conditions that they're in, their ecosystem engineering, their system, their environment, right? They make it more wet, essentially. So they catch light better, they shade out things better, their leaves don't curl when they fall, they're typically thin, they don't have the lobing, they're flat, they hold more moisture for longer, it's more shade in that understory, and that creates this positive feedback where as they get established and they start putting all these leaves on the ground, they then also discourage the recurrence of fire. So you get that's what that process means.
And if you want to burn those areas, sometimes you can't even get a fire to carry.
Yeah. So
unless the conditions are, really dry with a lot of wind or something like that, hazardous conditions to burn in.
Yeah. I've had a series of episodes on this topic on Fire University. So if you're really interested, we also have some videos online that are showing you these different things on the ufdeerlab YouTube page, so you can see some of these things that we're talking about. But so in other words, I don't want to belabor all those points right here
sure.
for sake of time and interest. But the plant community changes over time when you take fire out of it, and it starts to become less flammable, and then it starts to, in this positive feedback, make it harder to burn. And then you get into conditions that people come to me all the time about, where, oh, I would love to burn during this time window, like during the summer in an upland hardwood forest. Well, good luck, because that closed canopy condition, even if the overstory, those mature oaks are still pyrophytic, you now have a mid-story or codominant trees that are mesophytic. And one of our studies showed that you only have to get about 30% of the leaf litter contributed by those mesophytic species before it just shuts fire down.
Yeah.
Like, it really starts to affect flammability of the system, and you just can't even burn, particularly during the growing season months. So
you
you're
can
now
kiss your
relegated.
nesting and brood rearing habitat goodbye at that point.
Yeah. So, and all that to say, it may look to you like that forest hasn't changed, but it is changing substantially, and it's continuing to change as those, maples or whatever start to take dominance. Beech, a lot of those species, once they start to take dominance, you kind of get on that slope where you have to have some sort of a dramatic intervention, a timber harvest, to get rid of those species, or a hack and squirt operation or something like that, before it gets back, reverted back to a condition that's flammable.
Right.
So all that to say, I feel like I ended up on a diatribe about that. If you look at the maps on where the fire regimes have been restricted over time, which is in this Nowak and Abrams paper that we'll provide for everybody, they have a bunch of maps showing you that change, and it is substantial. Just looking across the landscape, you can imagine where those might be. Up in the upper Midwest, that's where it's been most substantial, because it's all the grassland that was super flammable is now agriculture, as you mentioned earlier. But if you look down across the South through the Pine Belt, a lot of that has changed substantially as well in terms of its flammability.
And some of these pine plantations are actually responsible for it. We think of pine as even loblolly as a pyrophytic species, but if it's not regularly burned and thinned, like we were talking about is the case with many of them earlier for a variety of reasons, then you get a sweet gum mid-story or maple or elm or something like that coming up in it, and these areas get wet too.
Yep, they certainly can. Also, transition from one pine species to another pine species can affect flammability.
Yeah.
And there's been some really cool work. Morgan Varner has done a bunch of this that I talked to him about it, where they were looking at the flammability of species. Would you like to take a gander on what they did? One study, I don't think that you've seen it, where they tested the flammability of like 50 species in the South.
I've seen him present this, but it's been a few years, so my memory is hazy on it.
Most people, if I asked you, what do you think was most flammable?
You'd say longleaf pine needles.
Most people would say pine needles, yeah. And it wasn't.
What was it?
Chestnut.
Oh, man. How wild is that?
Isn't that something?
So like American chestnut leaves? That's crazy.
Yeah, if you look at it, I actually asked him because it's kind of like a little outlier.
Yeah.
And I was like, what is going on with this? But for those that don't know, we had chestnut blight come through, and according to historical accounts, that was potentially one of the most widespread trees. Well, it's functionally extinct now because of this blight that came through and wiped them all out. And that happened over a really short time frame. That wasn't relevant to the last 2 decades necessarily, but certainly something that's changed a lot in the past 100 years.
And to couple with, to add on to that, there are a lot of biologists that believe that chestnuts were a more important hard-massed food source for wildlife than acorns at that
Yeah,
time.
that's incredible. So
Yeah,
things have changed.
yeah, for sure.
Okay.
I got one more kind of big picture. And are you done with that
Well,
segment,
I think
or
so.
do you have
The main thing
better?
is, the vegetation that was supporting fire and being affected by fire has changed substantially, even in the last
Yeah,
couple of decades.
yeah. Well, let me give one more stat on this before we move on to other cover types, non-forest cover types, that really blew my mind. Okay, so we've been talking a lot about this conversion to pine plantation. We have gone from less than 2 million acres of southern pine plantation in the 1950s. All right, we had less than 2 million acres in the 1950s to 32 million by the end of the 1990s. So from less than 2 in the 50s to more than 32 million by the end of the 90s. I had a hard time even getting my head around
A
what 32.
16-fold change.
Yeah. Well, not only that, but how much, how do you get your head around what is 32 million acres, right?
Well,
It's a
I'm
lot, but
yeah.
I got to put it into some context that I can understand it. So, um, I looked up what the total acreage of the state of Alabama is, 33 million acres.
So we've got an Alabama worth of new pine.
And that was in the 90s.
Yeah,
So, we're 30 years beyond that at this point. There's no telling what we've racked up.
yeah. So in the lifetime of most of our listeners, at least in the South, but I think it applies elsewhere,
Yeah.
the landscape has dramatically changed.
You could say that.
Yeah, and also for the listeners, I have some pine on my family's property that was planted in 1994, I'm pretty sure, and it did not get its thinning, and it has not been burned. So it's kind of my indicator of what that looks like. And we have not had turkeys in it until just recently.
You got to get on that, Marcus.
You are you're not telling me anything.
You add that to your to-do list.
Yeah. Well, it's not
All
my
right.
choice, so maybe one day.
I got you. I got you. So you want to move on from hating on pine plantations for a minute?
Yeah. Well, one thing. I just want to caveat. That's not to say that having pine plantation is inherently bad.
Absolutely not.
It can be managed such that it is a great place for a turkey to live.
It can. And what we're speaking to here is the average. The average is how
Yeah.
they're typically managed.
Yeah.
And
People keep telling us nothing's changed, and we won't see
yeah.
the data on it.
And
So
I mean,
don't
while
go
we're
hating on us. That these are real numbers that we've dug up in these papers.
so let's change over now from forest to focusing on another cover type, because in this circles us back to the conservation reserve program again. And this is
Man,
something that I
you're going to
think.
get a letter from NRCS or something
Oh
over this.
no.
Do
Oh
they still
no.
send letters? Maybe a DM. You're going to get a
They
DM from the
they might make
NRCS.
they might make an exception for me, right?
I hope they send you a
so
letter.
so there's also been, and this is something that I mentioned early in the episode, a lot of conversion of areas to exotic pasture grasses.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that this is something that you're more familiar with, or not more familiar with than pine plantation, but it was something that you had made a point to talk about as well.
Mm-hmm.
But there, and maybe you know this, I don't know what practice it's under, but apparently there was a lot of tall fescue that was planted as part of the CRP.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know specifically what practice that was, or what they were trying to accomplish with that?
I don't remember the number off the top of my head, and I think there's more
Okay.
than one. But that's one thing that I think is a little bit confusing. This whole program, this is actually, I think, the most funding legislated for conservation, that like the biggest example of that ever, like
Mm-hmm.
globally. I may be wrong about that. Somebody let me know if you know of a program that has been more funding, but the Farm Bill was enormous, but it also is super complex in terms of what it includes.
Mm-hmm.
Like it includes, uh, the kinds of things that we've been talking about, but also other practices that have nothing to do with things you would associate with conservation.
Yeah.
So one thing that's pretty consistent in it is that they're trying to address water concerns with water and soils from
Yes.
agriculture that affect that water. So a
Yes.
lot of the practices are designed to hold soil in place or catch nutrients before they get into water. Those kinds of things.
Right.
So
And my guess is that's where a lot of this grass planting stemmed
yeah,
from. It was done with the intention of reducing erosion.
yes, I think that's probably the case. So it may seem counterintuitive to you if you were thinking that those practices, the primary objective were wildlife habitat. That would seem counterintuitive, but that
Mm-hmm.
frankly is not the case with a bunch of practices. Wildlife are not necessarily the driving objective, and then many of
Mm-hmm.
them they are not
Yeah.
the primary
Right.
objective.
Right.
Many of them are strictly associated with other things like erosion.
Right.
So I suspect that was the primary objective of those particular practices. But the other thing that's really hard, I try to teach about the Farm Bill. I can't even keep up with it. It changes,
Mm-hmm.
and which practices are available to who. That's why we need the NRCS folks at those offices that keep up with how
Yeah.
things are changing, because I can't keep up with it.
Yeah.
So,
And I do
but
want to
yeah,
make clear
so
that the
there were
Conservation Reserve Program does have some practices that have put tremendous amounts of high quality wildlife habitat on the landscape.
no question.
But
But
this
there are also
particular,
some practices are literally go plant fescue.
yeah, and that's what I want to talk about now for a second is particularly tall fescue and Bermuda grass, because
Ugh.
there's a lot of that. The tall fescue in particular
I'm gonna
has been
I'm gonna predict. Wait, I got to stop you for just a second.
okay.
I hope we get John Groce on here, but I'm gonna predict right now, if we get him on here, he's going to say something along the lines of Bermuda and cockroaches will be the only thing left, and they're going to figure it out and have some sort of mutualism to survive when we get hit by an asteroid. It's going to wipe
Yeah,
the Earth clean of devoid of life, except for those two. he,
yeah,
he said that because he's done tons and tons of prairie restoration work,
yeah.
grassland restoration, that sort of stuff. And man, Bermuda, it's
So
just
the problem with these, and I've mentioned exotic pasture grasses in general several times already today, and the reason, just real briefly, that those are undesirable from a turkey habitat perspective is that they form these dense mats or these dense sods, which is why we use them in pastures and why we use them in our yards, because it looks nice and it has this dense, even coverage. But the problem with that is that it precludes other other species of plants from growing in the area, particularly these forbs that are so important in breeding areas that we talked about, many times already. Um, and they are difficult for poults to move through.
mhm.
So that's kind of the
And
brief
potentially
background.
some other things associated with them, like holding moisture that
Right.
are hard to deal with. And another thing that I want to make clear right here, real quick, that doesn't mean that turkeys don't use them, and it doesn't necessarily apply to all parts of their life cycle.
Yeah.
Like, that's a great place to strut.
Right.
So you might see them use it for stuff like that. They
Hmm.
also may use it if they don't have another choice.
Right.
So making turkeys and turkeys using it are not necessarily the same thing. And we're going to belabor this, I'm sure, through the whole
Yeah.
habitat thing. But, just because you see strutters in it does not mean that it is making lots of turkeys.
Yeah. Certainly, if you live in a forest pasture land matrix, and so those pastures are the only open cover types that are available to turkeys. It doesn't matter if they're in fescue, Bermuda, Bahia, grass, something else. You're going to see turkeys in them.
Yeah,
They
you're
have
gonna. I mean,
to
where
use
else?
those openings.
Yeah, and it's a great place. Nice, clean, high visibility place to strut in.
Right.
So,
But that
I just
doesn't
wanted to
necessarily mean they're optimal.
right. It's still a place a poult's going to die.
Yeah, for sure.
So, just keep that in mind. We're going to go into a lot of this in more detail, but I just felt like we needed to address that head on directly.
So 35% of the southeastern CRP acreage was planted to introduce grasses, the main one of those being tall fescue. And if you zoom in on a little bit smaller scale, specifically focusing on Kentucky and Tennessee, over 90% of the CRP plantings in those two states were tall fescue.
I don't have much to say about that. So, the say that statistic before the Kentucky one again.
35% of CRP in the southeast was planted to introduce grasses, primarily tall fescue.
A third of the CRP was introduction of grass.
Mm-hmm.
Man,
That's right.
man.
So this is what really blew my mind even more than the pine plantation statistic. And this is from Barnes and Others 2013, impact of 3 exotic invasive grasses in the southeastern US on wildlife. Tall fescue covers an estimated 216 million acres of the southeast. 216 million acres.
Give us some context. I know you looked it up. How many states is that?
We'll go back to Alabama again. That's 6.5 Alabamas.
In just the South.
Yeah.
Is that? Oh. Well, there's your problem.
So that's 6.5 million acres that is not supporting poults.
Have you ever seen that? It's all over social media, and I'm having trouble remembering where it was, so don't bash me about this, but it's something like, I know what the problem is. Ain't got no gas in it. Have you seen that?
Yeah, I say that to my wife every time I drive her car. Ain't got no gas in it.
Yeah, sling blade.
Yes.
I know what the problem is.
Her gas tank is always empty.
Oh my gosh. All right. You know what? I have directly been trying to kill all that grass, and I just can't do it, man.
Yeah. So and before we move on from fescue to Bermuda, it's not very good either.
Oh, you're just saying fescue.
This is just fescue.
How many millions acres? How many Alabamas?
Gosh, you're making me change units on the fly.
You got to be able to roll this stuff off the tongue. You can't lay that on me and not know the metrics. Come on.
That's 6.4 Alabamas. I love how we're measuring in Alabamas. 6.4 Alabamas worth of fescue grass.
Good Lord. How many Bermuda? How many Alabamas are in Bermuda?
But just wait. I want to provide this concrete example for our listeners to understand how negatively fescue sod can affect wildlife. So this was in that same paper. They referenced another paper, and they talked about a case study where in Kentucky there was this farm had 1,000 acres of fescue sod on it, and they used herbicides and some soil disturbance to convert all that 1,000 acres of fescue sod to native grasses and forbs. And they monitored bobwhites on the property, which, of course, as we've already established, have similar habitat requirements to broods, right?
Yeah.
And so when they converted that 1,000 acres of fescue sod to native grasses and forbs, the bobwhite population on that property increased from 9 to 60 coveys over a 3-year period without any other habitat manipulation.
Do what? 9 to 60?
To 60 coveys with no other habitat manipulation other than eradicating the fescue sod and disturbing the soil.
They didn't plant anything.
They didn't plant anything.
They didn't plant anything.
No.
Kill the grass, folks.
I mean, how powerful is that?
We just spent. I hate to get back on this, but I feel like we need to put this in context, and I'm not talking about in Alabama's. We just spent a whole series on predator trapping where we're trying to get 10%. Maybe 15%. Okay, great. Let's call it double that and 30%. We're trying to get that out of trapping. And you're telling me that they just went and killed the grass and they went from 9 coveys to 60.
So basically 600%.
And they don't have to mow the grass. I'm just saying, like, come on.
You're really selling it. I know.
Sixfold.
Talk about a difference in return on investment, right?
Yeah. And they didn't plant anything that was just disturbing the dirt after you kill the grass.
Mm-hmm.
Good grief.
That's right.
I'm getting upset about this now.
So I told you would. That's why it was hard for me to sit on this earlier today. I wanted to tell you because I was baffled.
I know. I'm glad you found these numbers.
So tall fescue was at 216 million acres. That's 6.4 Alabama's, right?
Mm-hmm.
Bermuda grass, like you said, Bermuda grass and cockroaches, 175 million acres of the Southeast.
Almost as much as fescue. Yeah,
that's 5.2 Alabama's.
Oh, you already did the math on it?
I knew you were going to ask me.
Yeah. How many is that together? 11.6? 11.6 Alabama's.
Like almost 12 Alabama's worth of fescue and Bermuda combined.
And you know what? I deal with almost exclusively Bahia.
Yeah.
So
we haven't even gotten into Bahia yet.
Yeah.
I don't have stats on that. I don't have stats on that one, but it's probably close to it.
I don't know, man. It's got to be.
Yeah.
So that study that you found, was that focused on the Mid-South?
Barnes et al. Was the entire South.
Okay. And they don't have Bahia in that?
So it's just because they chose to focus on they identified the top 3 exotic invasive grasses that they thought posed the greatest harm to wildlife.
What is number 3?
And it was Kogan grass.
Oh, is that? I thought we were talking about ones that people were planting.
No, it's not. This particular paper is just about problematic grass species.
Okay. Yeah. That's my bad. Kogan.
Yeah. Sorry if I changed over papers too quickly for you there.
No. It's me. It's not you. I notice I have to get you to repeat stuff a lot. And I'm not just doing that for the listeners. That's also for me. But it also lets me try to put this into Alabama's, like I'm trying to put it into context so that I can wrap my head around this stuff.
I'm just going to start using Alabama's as my basic unit of area and everything that I do. This food plot is 1/1,000,000th of an Alabama.
I kind of want to publish a paper and try to get that unit through. Let's do that. We gotta have some kind of ridiculous measure of area. That's what we need. We need to be figuring out how to snake in unusual units of area into the.
We're going to develop our own measurement system. It's not English. It's not metric. It's Southern.
Yeah.
All right, man. Those are my numbers that I really wanted to throw out today, and so I didn't know if you wanted to go into talking about this at a little bit more localized scale. So for the individual that is thinking about their property and turkey population changes that have occurred there over time and
I,
habitat changes along with that, or if you
I
wanted to
think we
talk
should.
about.
I think we should do that in part two.
Okay.
But what I do think we should do to close this episode out. I mean, we're already over an hour.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so, given all this landscape change, which is pretty substantial,
Yeah.
so we've got all this forest that potentially is undesirable in many respects for turkeys, at least at a landscape level. That doesn't mean that there aren't really good examples of it being managed exceptionally. That combined with this mass conversion to grass, non-native pasture grass,
Mm-hmm.
that's just in that one program. Well, I guess your one paper, that was how much coverage there is of it, right? Not just what was in CRP.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Not
So
just what
that
was in
actually is
CRP.
capturing the full scale of it. We've
That's
got
right. That's right.
11 and a half Alabamas worth of grass or whatever. And the other one is so unremarkable I can't even remember it now. What was the other? Oh, the shift or change in grasslands to agriculture.
Yeah.
So, what does that mean for a turkey in terms of its life cycle, just in general?
To be honest with you, Marcus, I was thinking about this earlier, and it was just one more of those data pieces that we've discussed since we've started this podcast that makes me baffled that we even have any turkeys left. And this is all really everything that we've talked about today has really transpired over the past, we're closing in on just like 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
That's a blink of an eye, you know.
Yeah.
And it's no wonder that turkey populations did so well starting out because, you know, a lot of the stocking was going on through like 60s, 70s, 80s. And that's when a lot of these conversions that were unfavorable for turkeys were just starting to be initiated. So,
Mm-hmm.
you
Well,
had
and then
fractions.
and also initially they might be good because you're opening up places and disturbing the ground, and in
Like a pine
general,
plantation during those first few years.
yeah, like in general,
Absolutely.
at first that might be
Those
really
field
good.
borders,
And
for the first few years until they get taken over by tall fescue.
yeah, then
So they can be favorable, but then you're talking about, almost, 35 to 40 years later, as all that has had time to develop and grow and expand, it's no wonder that we're potentially looking at an issue as we just covered in our density dependence episode series, where it's reasonable to believe that carrying capacity for turkeys has been greatly diminished across the landscape. Dr. Collier mentioned that we don't know what carrying capacity is, and he's absolutely right. I can't put a number on that. But when you're talking about scales that we're discussing that have been converted to these unfavorable conditions, you can't help but think intuitively that carrying capacity has been reduced.
well, and another thing, the human population has doubled,
Yeah.
right? Wasn't it 80 something percent change in part of it anyway?
Depending on where you are, yeah, it was very
So it
regional.
hasn't doubled, but y'all can rewind it and see what the numbers were. I don't remember them right off the top of my head, but it's a big change.
Right.
And that came with a whole bunch of infrastructure like roads and parking lots and buildings and all
Absolutely.
that stuff. And think about how that has spliced up the landscape in terms of connectivity,
Mm-hmm.
which I'm sure we'll get into a lot with the habitat stuff in this series. I'm with you, man. And then it's frustrating to me that folks still want to focus on predators.
Yeah.
It's like, come on.
Well, maybe it's because we haven't presented them with this data,
Yeah. Well, that's why we needed to do this. And I think hopefully this one resonates with people. Things have changed. And we're going
Yeah.
to talk about in the next part of this episode what might have even changed at the local scale, even on your property.
Yeah. And I mean,
So,
you just think about something as slow moving as the development of a forest. and noticing that over time.
Mm-hmm.
Even more potentially stealthy is the intrusion of an exotic pasture grass, right? Because not all of this acreage that we're talking about that is now in these species was planted that way, but once so much of it has been established across the landscape, it's spreading into other areas
Mm-hmm.
unintentionally. So, can you differentiate? I'm asking the listeners this: can you differentiate tall fescue versus Bermuda from some of our native warm season grasses? There's probably a lot of folks that can't because they've never been educated on how to do that. And so, if that's the case, then why would you ever notice that species composition has changed? You know,
Mm-hmm. Well,
and that'd be
and
very subtle.
this would be something we should ask John as well. He would have. I mean, I normally go to him with this kind of stuff, but he laments about Bermuda, like we were talking about,
Hmm.
because it is always the barrier. You know what I mean? Like if he's going somewhere and he's going to try to, like you may already even have it in a lot of native prairie forbs and
Yeah.
grasses, and it still has a Bermuda problem.
Right.
It's still there. Like it's a
Yeah.
thatch underneath all of the native plants.
Right.
And he's basically, I've heard him say it, you're trying to get it to a manageable level,
Yeah.
not get rid of it. You're trying to get it to a manageable level when you're doing
Yeah.
that restoration stuff.
Basically, a level that you can cope with.
Yes. So anyway, I think that's a good point. Learn some plants, and it's not just important to learn the good ones. Make sure
That's
that
right.
you know what you're looking for with these bad ones. I see Kogon grass down here all the time, all over the sides of the road, everywhere. I've seen forest patches that's 100% Kogon grass underneath it. You know, it's these things. You know, you need to understand when you have them,
Right.
and then it's another thing to understand how to control them.
Right.
So, but knowing you have
So
them,
kind
know
of
it's a problem, then knowing how to control it to get rid of the problem.
right. So looking forward a little bit in this episode series, I don't know that I can't promise that we're going to get all of these episodes scheduled, but some of the things that we're thinking about trying to cover, we know in this next episode that we're going to cover what's changed on my property over the course of 5, 10, 20 years and so on. And then we'd really like to get into more region specific landscape changes. I know that we've talked a lot about the Southeast today, but we want to bring in some outside perspectives on that as well.
Mm-hmm.
We're currently trying to figure out who the go-to people are on that topic, and then maybe talking a little bit more in depth from some of these timber companies, getting information from those individuals on what they're doing, what practices have changed, challenges in that
Mm-hmm.
industry, and things like that that are
Yeah,
affecting turkey habitat
what's
as well.
available? Maybe they have
Right.
options that are available to leaseholders that you could implement that you may or may not be aware of.
Right.
But,
And then maybe for the grand finale, we'll be able to maybe that'll bring us to the end of turkey season, and we can get Dr. Harper back in here.
yeah, we're trying to get him in here to tell you what you need to do to make high quality poultry and cover,
Right.
which we've clearly identified, and we just laid out a bunch of stats that make it obvious. One of the obvious reasons there isn't any, at the landscape scale. I wonder how many Alabama's worth of poultry and cover we have. I bet it's not one.
It's not one.
So think about that for a minute. We've got 11 Alabamas of grass, and some of those 11 Alabamas could be poultry and cover, and we'd probably go a long way if we just got to a couple Alabamas
That's right.
worth of it.
That's right.
So,
all right, we've rambled enough.
Yeah. Well, thanks everybody out there for listening. Hopefully, this kind of puts into context for you some things that have changed across the landscape. Again, thanks for all your interaction, all this feedback. It's driving us to cover topics like this, and we've just gotten this so commonly. Please continue to help us by sharing. I've been seeing the podcast get shared all over the place online. Thank you for helping do that. Please continue. If you haven't had a chance, take a second to rate the podcast. All of those things are helping us get this word out to more people. And hopefully, if we keep on doing it, we could get a few Alabama's worth of poultry and cover around the landscape. That'd be kind of nice. So thank you all for listening and helping us trying to get this out.
Yeah, thank you guys. Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.